All right, so this is what we call the Undead Labs Data Editor. This is actually not part of the Unreal Editor. This is an extra tool that we built outside of Unreal to help us manage the sheer amount and complexity of data that we were building around things like traits. Also, all of the guns, their data is edited in here. Basically, anything where we needed to create a huge number of pieces of content and balance them all against each other in one place, in a very searchable, in a very sort of validated format. And we could talk about what a lot of that means later on down the line. But basically, we felt like, some of the needs of these particular systems could be better served by a custom tool that we used rather than using what comes natively in the Unreal Editor. So that's what you're looking at here. Everything in the Undead Labs Data Editor has got sort of this tree structure to it. Even our mission designs, which are also done in here. Our mission scripting is done with this kind of tree structure where everything has sort of got an order to it, and you can basically, you build something on a high level, and then you can give it children that inherit things. And so let me just sort of show you what the structure of this looks like. And by the way, I usually have this stretched out much bigger across a 1440p screen. I've shrunk it down to a quarter of that, hoping that those of you who watch this show on a phone will be able to follow what's going on. So I hope that you can. I don't think I could have made it usable and made it much smaller than this. We don't do this kind of job on a phone. We do this on the largest screen we can slap our faces against. But this right here is basically, this is a list of all the different categories of traits that are in the game. Most of the traits in the game fall under starter traits. These are the traits that basically can be assigned to any randomly generated character at their inception, like when they're created from a character schema. And so you can see there's 1,316 of these. In addition to that, we've got a bunch of different types that I'm not actually going to explain all of them. Injuries is an interesting one. You might not have realized that all injuries are actually secretly traits under the hood. We don't list them with the traits on the character sheet. We list them, near your health bar. But as you can see, they're sort of grouped here where, these are the injuries that you get from blunt force trauma, a sprained wrist, abrasions, cracked ribs, dislocated shoulder, and each of these has got different effects on you, different effects on your health bar, different effects on your character's capabilities when you have them. From an explosion, you could get second-degree burns, shrapnel, third-degree burns, which are different levels of severity. And from a fall, you could get a sprained ankle or a fractured disc, very different levels of severity. And so whenever we're sort of injuring you and we're sort of rolling randomly to determine whether you get injured and what kind of injury you get, that comes from this list of traits. So they're traits under the hood because basically a trait is a thing you can apply to a character, and it sticks with them indefinitely, and it carries with it a set of buffs for that character and sometimes for the community. And because we had already made traits, when it was time to make injuries we're going to need to do all the same things as traits, so we just made them traits. And you'll see that a lot in game development. Like, if something already does a certain job and you want something else to do a similar job, you just co-opt the thing you already have rather than writing something entirely new. So if you go to...
I think we've already got a winner.
Oh, really? What's that?
Yeah. Career, game designer trait, never checks with QA. Quote, my ideas work. No need to double check. Sometimes waste materials. Mike Gallagher.
Thank you, Mike Gallagher. Yes, that is an excellent suggestion for a trait. Unfortunately, I'm going to be implementing the ones that I already made notes on that we gathered from social media prior to this stream. But that is an excellent idea, and I feel like people would probably appreciate it. People on the team would probably appreciate it if they encountered that, if I stuck it in the game. So let me, so for instance here, this is the Daybreak list. This is a set of traits we added when we added Daybreak, and this is all the Red Talon traits. So these traits, they're not on the starter traits list, which means they can't be added to a regular character. Only the characters who specifically are designed with a schema that insists on this category of traits will get those traits. And so that's why Red Talon characters have traits that no one else has. It's because they fall under this list. And I realized while I was going through this that actually I've made a tradition of saying that I made 1,350 traits in the game, but over time we keep adding a new one here and there, and I think the number is actually closer to 1,400 now, which is a little bit crazy. So let's open up the starter traits and see how this list is sort of categorized. So we've got, let's see, let me just close some of these. I opened a bunch of these things up so that I could look at them myself. But basically, we've divided the traits up into broadly what they affect, whether they affect cardio or wits or the fighting skill or the shooting skill, whether they have community benefits, like broad community benefits, like they help with morale or they offer an income or something like that. Combo, which is just a catch-all place for traits that do multiple things and they don't really fit into any category. Quirk, these are the traits that unlock those quirk skills, those extra fifth skills that don't fall into any of the normal categories, some of which we'll be making today. Stats, which affect things like your health, your stamina, how fast not how fast, but how much your fuel efficiency with a car, various things like that are not skills. Minor is just traits that are there mostly for storytelling. Some of them have small effects, but mostly they're just there to sort of flesh out the character. And then philosophy. This has to do with basically whether you are a sheriff or a warlord, things like that, the kind of attitude that your character has. So we've subdivided them into all of these categories here. And if we open up one of these, I'm trying to remember which one it was now. I think it might have been wits. I wanted to sort of look at one particular trait. Now, we've also subdivided these so that, like, the traits that are just good, they just improve your wits, go in this category. Traits that actually give you a wit specialization, so you, out of the gate, that character starts with a specialized skill, that goes under the advanced section. And then hindered, these are people who have limited wits. Things like gullible, things like easily distracted, things like forgetful. But we're not going to look at those right now. Let's look at one of our advanced wits traits to sort of go down the data and sort of talk about how a trait is put together before we start making some traits ourselves. So this right here, this is the name that we use to reference this trait when we're sort of calling it out somewhere else in the game. If we have something that wants to assign the wallflower trait to a character, this is how we reference it. And you don't see this when you're in the game. This is just the name we use internally. They all have to be unique. They all have to be these long strings without any spaces in them. And that's not how we want you to see the traits in the game. This right here is the display name, wallflower. This is what you actually see on your character sheet when your character gets this trait. The weight, 100, this is how we make traits more or less common than other traits. So this one has 100. That's sort of the average value that we put on things. If we want to make a trait uncommon, like, for instance, burglar, we reduce the number. So that means that the burglar trait will come up a quarter of the frequency of the wallflower trait, which is at 100. If we wanted a trait to be very common, we'd give it a bigger number. We could make it 400 to make it 4 times as common as wallflower. And then you'll notice we got the display name, and then if you look at your traits flyout and you see the descriptions of the traits, you'll see something like this. I'm really, really good at not being noticed. And so this is sort of explains like a little bit of sort of the backstory of the trait, like what it means to the character to have this trait. And what I'm implying here is this character's a wallflower, like they're the person who, they're not out dancing in the middle of the floor at the dance. They're the person who's standing by the wall just watching what's going on. And we're implying that means that person is particularly good at stealth. And so right here, this is their hero bonus. This is referencing the specific hero bonus that this character could have because they have this trait. When we're picking a hero bonus for a character, we look at all of their traits. There's usually about 3 on a character, and we basically roll randomly amongst the hero bonuses that those traits suggest. So if a character has the wallflower trait, there's like a 1 in 3 chance they'll end up with the quiet time hero bonus, which I can look up right now, actually, because the hero bonuses are in the same file. So if we go and look at noise quiet time, we can see that this is, I've set up certain hours at night where we try to keep the noise down to give people a chance to really relax and think, and it reduces noise at the base by 1. So it's a pretty minor hero bonus, but that's what that does. So a character who's a wallflower is likely to have that hero bonus. And then down here, we've got the tags. The tags are an interesting little system. These are how we try to manage which traits belong together on the same character. Because when you've got procedurally generated characters, one of the things that you worry about is, I'm in a randomly generated character that makes no sense, that contradicts itself, that feels false, that feels wrong. And if you're handcrafting a character, you can make a character who is full of contradictions, and that's an interesting character, but to make that work, you have to really put the writing time into explaining that character, justifying that character. And when you're randomly generating a bunch of characters, you don't have that opportunity to explain to a player and to justify to a player why this character is full of contradictions. So if you end up rolling up a character who seems to have apparent contradictions, it just feels like you failed. It just feels like you messed something up. It doesn't feel like you made an interesting character. And so we had to come up with a system that would let characters not contradict themselves. So for instance, we've got this trait, this tag called attribute, which means that this is, a description of a person's personality, and we only let each character have one. So if we give a character an attribute trait, that means that they can't have another one, so we don't end up with two of them contradicting each other. We might actually let them have two attributes, I'm not sure, but there's also there's different categories, like for instance, before story. That's a similar tag. We only let characters have one before story. And what a before story is it's some trait that tells you a story about their life before the outbreak. And because those could easily conflict with each other, we only let each character have one of those. Similarly, a story about what they did in the wake of the outbreak. That gets the after story tag, which means that we can't have two conflicting stories. One that says, this is how I survived, and another one says, actually, this is how I survived. That would feel wrong. It would feel fake and bad. And so we make sure that they're categorized that way. Similarly, if you already have a trait that affects your standing, you can't have another trait that affects your standing. If you already have a trait that affects the wit skill, we don't give you another trait that affects the wit skill, because in mechanical ways, those could interfere with each other and make the character not make any sense balance-wise. And then we have a few more things here, like hero. We just put that on every trait that has a hero bonus, so we can make sure that every character ends up with a hero bonus. Not badass is something we put on characters who, they have traits that make them sound just a little bit pathetic. So if we want to have a character who is incredibly badass, and that's like the main way they come across, we give them the badass tag. And if they have the opposite of that, we give them the not badass tag. And then conflict peaceful, somebody who's a wallflower, when there's going to be a conflict in the base, they're not going to be involved typically. And so we put this tag on characters who have certain traits to say this character is not going to be the one starting fights or even being involved in fights. And so that, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt here.
Oh, go for it.
A very important thing has been brought up in chat. The desperate need for a taco connoisseur, taco chef trait. And I will go so far as to say that anybody with that name should have the name Brant on it as well.
Okay, we will have to keep that in mind. Maybe we'll have some time to sneak that in at the end. By the way, something Viscid just said that the wallflower trait should have the line, "I can make it home with one headlight," which is out there for all you 90s kids like me. Thanks, Viscid. So there's a lot of different kinds of tags we can put on this. This is just a few of them. But let's move on to the next section. So buffs, character buffs. These are things that will basically change the stats of the character. So in this particular case, the wallflower trait affects a character's standing rate. So standing is the thing that fills up your little bar that says citizen until it says hero, and that's when you start contributing your hero bonus to the community and when you're eligible to be made a leader. This character, because they're a wallflower, they gain those standing rewards at 50% the rate, which means it takes them twice as long to become a leader because they're shy, they're unassuming, they don't put themselves out there, which is fine. I mean, they can eventually become a leader. It just takes them a little bit longer to get comfortable. Nicknames. Here we can give characters nicknames based on their traits, and we're going to get into this a little bit more later. But basically, we wanted characters to have names that are not just based on their given names and their last names. We wanted characters to have some nicknames that are based on some story from their past or from some attribute that other people notice in them, and that they've given them a nickname based on that. So in this particular case, a character who is known as a wallflower might have a nickname that is evocative of a flower, like Bud, Violet, or Florian. And we've got these split up by gender. You can see it sort of lined up here: male, female, non-binary. And so because names in our culture are so heavily gendered, it feels weird for a character to get a name that feels like it's the wrong gender for that character. And so we make sure that we have the ability in sort of the way that we mark up this text, because there's a lot of places where I can just stick a sort of a name that doesn't feel gendered at all. You can just slap the name in this slot. You don't need to put all this fancy stuff here. But if you've got a name that does sound gendered, you can split it up so that depending on the gender of the character, they'll get a different version of the nickname, depending on who they are. Here we've got community buffs, which are not used very often by traits, because traits tend to be about the individual. Community buffs are an entirely different category of buffs that affect the entire community at large. Things like incomes of resources and noise at the base, stuff like that. Here and there, we do have traits that affect that, but it's a little bit less common, and Wallflower doesn't affect it. And then we've got skill operations and modifications. This is all of the stuff that makes a trait, say, affects skills in its description. And basically, this is how we assign you brand new skills. Like in this case, we're giving you the stealth specialization. We're just basically blasting all the way through wits, saying this character already got their wits to the maximum, and they've selected the stealth specialization already. And then on top of that, we add 2 levels of stealth on the character. So they basically start with 2 levels of stealth, plus or minus just a little bit of extra experience that we sort of slap on at the end to dirty them up a little bit, make them look a little bit more lived in. So that is sort of the makeup of a trait. That's how we put it together. So every time you make a trait, you basically go down this list and you sort of make all of these decisions about that trait. And that's what I was doing for a month or so of my life in like 2016 or something, 2017 maybe. I was going through and doing this hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times until we got this entire list.